Would you please pray with me? Let the words of our mouths and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So we teach a preaching class here at House of Prayer, and I always teach the preaching people in the class that all preaching begins with prayer. You pray to God to give you the words to preach. And sometimes I feel like I should have been more clear with God in my praying, that I would like them at an acceptable time in anticipation of the moment of preaching. This morning's sermon came this morning, after I wrote another one earlier. I want to talk about what's important in our lives. What's important? So let me start by sharing a story that relates to the gospel. It happens all the time, and I'm sure that's your experience, but in other sorts of places in life. But on Mondays and Fridays, I'm home with the kids, and I watch the two smaller ones when Jacob's at school. And it never fails. There's usually a point in the morning or afternoon where I'm at my computer doing work, and I realize I haven't heard the children for a while. And that's never a good thing when you don't hear the children for a while. You're like, oh, they're back in the bedroom with the door shut, just the way I tell them not to. And so you go back there, and you open the door and say, what are you guys doing back here? And what do they say? Nothing. Because what they were doing was probably not good, and you don't want to share it with Dad. That's the disciples today. Last week I kind of threw the disciples under the bus and said they're a bunch of idiots, but then I redeemed Peter at the end. But this time, they really are a bunch of idiots. They're walking down the road, following Jesus. And you can picture this happening. Jesus is ahead, maybe talking to Peter or one of the other disciples, and the rest of them are back there like, if Jesus is God, this is going to turn out awesome. I'm going to be the greatest. No way! I'm going to be the greatest. And they're just trying to keep it. No, I think I'm going to be the great. Oh, James is he's pretty smart, but no, it might be that. I mean, it might be Matthew. No, it was me. I'm the greatest. And so Jesus is up there, and they think Jesus doesn't hear. And so they get to the house then, or wherever they're going. And Jesus is like, hey guys, what were you talking about back there on the way? Just like my kids in the room. We're just walking. So to make his point, I mean, Jesus doesn't even really address the who's the greatest thing. He first talks about being least of all and servant of all. But then he does this thing. He pulls out this image that seems really familiar to us here in 2015. He pulls out a child. I don't know, maybe like a 3-year-old, like maybe like Eli's age, or maybe a little bit older like Alexander. He pulls out a child and holds this child up in front of them. It's cool in the gospel, the pronoun that gets used is it. He takes it and puts it in front. And that is indicative of a really big reality that is not our reality here in 2015. In 2015, what are children to us? Sacred. They're a treasure to us. We raise them up. In the liturgy here, we have a moment where we just step back and allow the children to walk around the space and have a special time of teaching. I mean, we gear down the language during this kind of high teaching moment down to just their level so that they can access it. We have schools built, almost like castles for children to learn in our own homes. Children are highly exalted. I mean, children have this really powerful, special place in our world nowadays. We talk about here in the church about the children being the future of the church. If we were smarter, we'd say they are the church right now rather than the future. But children just have this super awesome place in our society. That is not the way it was in Jesus' day. Children were exactly the opposite of that in the first century. A number of weeks ago, I talked about how women really didn't have any significant role in society. We talked about the Syro-Phoenician woman who came up, and she was already a low person on the totem pole just because she was a woman. Women were borderline property, and guess who watched the children? The women. They were even lower than women. I don't know that there were schools like there are now. I'm not sure they were taught. They weren't educated. Children were there to exist until they could be old enough to do one of two things. Take over the family job if you were a guy and do what your dad did, which is why we find the fishermen fishing with their dad when Jesus pulls them out of their thing they're doing. Or if you were a girl, hopefully you got enough money with your dowry when you got married. That was children's role. And so it's really hard for us, sitting here in 2015, to understand the symbology going on when Jesus pulls up a child here. We have to really pull ourselves out of our mindset from now and look at it the way Jesus would have been using this example then. And so Jesus pulls this piece of property, this something that had no real value or no real role in society, just a timekeeper until they got old enough to be of any value. And Jesus raises this thing, it's a person, this person, and puts it in front of them and shows how valuable, and talks about how valuable this one is. So obviously the symbol is hard for us to wrap our heads around, but the point Jesus is trying to make is not. It is not hard to think about people in our society or things in our society that do not hold value as a society. But our Lord, our Jesus, does hold them up as great value. So there has been one person in the congregation in particular that has told me on a couple occasions that they get frustrated with my preaching because I make these points like this, like I have right now, in generalities and in large kind of 30,000 feet from above points, and then I never get down to the floor for her. And I say to her, very astute of you, I do not. Because you have one particular set of experiences, and then there are 90 other people that have a whole bunch of other set of experiences. It's a troubling thing when you're preaching to get down to this, to ground value and make the point about there being people and things in your own worlds that have great value that is applicable for everybody. So, I'm going to give you the opportunity to do that on your own in groups. But before you do that, I'm going to give an example for myself of how this happened in my life recently, about how I was actually made to be the one that culturally doesn't have a whole lot of value and was kind of raised up and had a real sort of God experience. So on Labor Day, I was out riding my bike. And bikers don't get a whole lot of respect on the roads. I've had people honk at me, call me unflattering things. I know, hard to believe, right? They have run at me a little bit. I've gotten people hit me, come pretty close to me, do dangerous things. Sometimes it's not a great environment. So I was riding through Ambridge, and I was about ready to come to a four-way stop sign and make a left-hand turn. And there's a car coming from my right, also to the four-way stop sign. And so I came up, and I didn't quite unclip at the stop sign, but I waited to see what they were going to do. And they stopped, and they waved me on. So I kept going and made the left-hand turn through the stop sign, and I look in my mirror on my bike, and I see the guy coming up behind me. I'm like, okay, so I get way over to the side of the road, and he pulls up beside me, and the window goes down. I'm like, oh dear, here we go. I'm like looking for the bailout place. What happens when he throws a water bottle at me, or he does something obnoxious, or just cusses me out? And he rolls down his window and he goes, hey, I just wanted to say thanks for stopping at that stop sign back there. You're about the only cyclist I've ever seen follow the rules of the road. And I just wanted to say thanks for that good work. And he put his thumb up and then kept going. You know what I said back to him? Nothing, because I was waiting for the punchline. I was waiting for the water bottle or the pop can or whatever it was coming up my head. But let me tell you, that moment of him stopping for a few minutes and saying those words, for a few seconds, and saying those words of affirmation, I was like giddy for miles after that, until I started dehydrating myself. But for a while, I was really excited about that moment. It just was so joy-filled. And I don't know if that guy was a Christian or if he was a faith person or why he did that, but I do know he didn't need to. He could have easily thought that in his head, as I have, about various things when I'm out driving, and buzzed right on through and never shared it. There are tons of opportunities for us all in our lives to do those sorts of things to make differences in other people's lives. To take people and situations that seem to be unimportant and make them important, to make a difference. And so there's a line that a guy I really like named Shane Claiborne. He talks about the early Christians. The early Christians and how they drew other people into their ranks as Christians. They didn't call themselves Christians, but people would join with them and follow Jesus, not because they were down in the corner, like beating their papyrus or whatever their vellum was. They weren't out there like saying, you need to follow Jesus or you're going to hell. They were not interested in that at all. But rather, the early Christians were all about caring for one another looking for those who were poor or hungry or in any sort of need, and gathering around them and lifting them up, for sitting with people in the midst of difficult things like death or loss or any sort of bad things that went on in life. And so Shane Claiborne likes to use the words that the early Christians people would start following them because of divine curiosity, because they were so curious about these people. They were so different from everyone else in society. And so now I want to finish this time by making it down to ground level. Gather in groups of like 5 or so and talk about experiences where someone went out of their way to raise you up in a way that like just isn't normal in our culture. Or think about things that you can do in your life, in your today, that can do little things to raise people up, to recognize the children in our midst, not the 2015 children in our midst, the 35 AD children in our midst. So spend a few minutes talking about that. Proclaim the gospel to each other. Now you can turn around and you can move yourself a little bit. Reorient yourselves a little bit. I know, shocking.